Hi, my name is Ashley, and I'm a mom of two little girls. I have a 4-year-old named Kylie, and I also have a 2-year-old named Mia. Now, the topic for today's video is one that I have touched upon several other times in some of my other videos, but it dawned on me the other day that this is a topic I have yet to exclusively dedicate a video to all by itself. And I figured that it was high time that I probably should, because it's something that has been coming up a lot for me personally in my own household lately, having both a toddler and a preschooler under the same roof, sharing the same play space 24/7. So from one busy parent to another, today I would like to share with you a little bit about the Montessori approach to sharing. So let's first spend a minute talking about this concept of sharing and what we mean by that. So I think it's pretty safe to say that adults as a whole tend to expect children to share their toys and their possessions with other children. They expect them to play nice. And oftentimes, because they are children, conflicts do arise where one child tries to take a toy from someone, or a child doesn't want to give up a toy that another child is interested in playing with them. They want to play by themselves. Or, they just walk over and snatch it away and then the other child is left crying. All of these issues tend to crop up, especially with young children, when it comes to sharing their things. And this often tends to make adults feel uncomfortable or nervous even, especially in group situations, because on one hand, you want to protect your own child, right? You want to protect their right to concentrate on whatever task it is that they've chosen without worrying about another child coming along and snatching it away. But then on the other hand, you don't want to hurt another child's feelings unintentionally. You don't want to offend their parents, what have you. There are a lot of these social factors at play. And so then we feel this need sometimes to step in as the referee and to start giving out ultimatums and saying, okay, well, you can play with it for 2 minutes, but then you have to give it up so that she can have a turn with it. Or you've been playing with it for long enough, you need to give it up to someone else. Or sometimes we feel the need to place our children into roles by saying things like, you're the big kid, you should know better, and you should share with them because they're just a baby and they don't know any better. And then sometimes we might even find ourselves so frustrated by the situation that we lash out emotionally at our child and say things like, why are you being so selfish? When our child really doesn't have a clue what exactly you mean by that. Because developmentally speaking, your child may not be ready to share yet. And that is the sticking point, is that sharing is a learned behavior. It is not something that our children are born knowing how to do. It's not something that they want to do even for the first couple of years. And that is 100% normal for children, for all children. So that's one of the things that I love so much about the Montessori approach, is that it does take child development into consideration. So instead of forcing our children to share against their will or long before they're developmentally ready, instead we're scaffolding these skills for our children from the moment that they're born all the way up through the preschool years and beyond, when they're actually ready to take on these skills themselves. So instead of placing yourself into the role of referee, where you constantly have to be deciding for children what exactly needs to happen, instead you are helping them to learn how to share by taking turns and how to problem solve these kinds of situations on their own. Now, really quickly, before we dive into some of the specifics, I want to do a quick little mental exercise with you just to get you into the right mindset. I want you to imagine that there are two children playing in the same play space. They are not playing with each other, they're playing separately. One is just kind of busily moving about from one thing to another in the play area, playing with lots of different things and experimenting. And then the other child is extremely focused on this gorgeous set of wooden blocks, just kind of off to the side by themselves. And they have been very intensely working on some kind of a castle or a tower for, the better part of the last 20 minutes or so, while you have been quietly observing. And it has suddenly come to your attention that the child who has been wandering around has now set their sights on these blocks. And they are very quickly making their way over to the child who has this gorgeous castle that they've been working on, and they're very focused on it. They don't even see the other child coming until it's too late. And the child comes over and they wreck their castle, or they come over and they start making a fuss about wanting to be involved, while the other child is very protectively, and hovering over their castle, okay? Very common scenario between two children. Now, the gut reaction that you are likely to have as a parent is going to be different from person to person, and also depending on the ages of the children that are involved. So for some people, it might be to immediately jump into that referee role and get in there and say, oh, no, don't touch her tower, don't touch her tower, and try to redirect the child away. Or you might say to the child who's been working, oh, you've been working on that long enough. Why don't you let her have a turn? Or maybe you say, why don't you give her a few blocks so that she can help you out with building your tower? Why don't you guys work together on it? You might have all these ideas and suggestions that you're doling out. Or let's say the child that comes over actually takes a couple of the blocks and walks off with them, and the other child is really upset about it. So then you might feel the need to, again, step in as the referee and say, hey, get back over here. Give those back to him. He was working with those. Or maybe you say to the child who was working, oh, you have like 35 of those. Is it really that big of a deal if she has just 1 or 2 of them? Or maybe the child that did the taking is a baby, and so when that happens, you say, oh, you know what? She's just a baby. She doesn't know any better. It's really not that big of a deal. And basically, in all of these situations, there is no validation of your child's feelings and their experience of what's going on. You're just flat out dismissing their feelings about the situation entirely and not taking that into account whatsoever. And honestly, that's not a really great place to be in this situation, because you want your child to trust you. You want your child to know that you have their back no matter what. Whether or not they were the child that had something taken from them, that you understand their position, or if they were the child that was doing the taking and they just couldn't control themselves in that moment, they too need to know that you understand their position and that you are there for them. It can be really helpful to reimagine that same scenario from each of the children's perspective. If you were the child who was working with the blocks and you were very focused and concentrated, maybe you had a goal in mind of this structure that you were planning to build, and then somebody else comes along and just kind of inserts themselves into the situation. They interrupt your focus and your concentration, which is something that as a parent we're trying to cultivate in our children. But somebody comes along and ruins the whole thing, basically. You would be pretty upset by that. And that is exactly how our children feel. But then on the other hand, the child who is doing the taking, there's a pretty good chance that that child just does not have the social skills yet. They don't understand how to take turns quite yet. They still need that guidance from you as the adult. But if you're that child, you're not really thinking about anything other than, oh, those are some really cool looking blocks and I really want to get my hands on those. I want to do what he's doing. And so you want to go over there and take a couple and try it for yourself. Or maybe you see a giant tower that is just begging to be knocked down, because that's what toddlers like to do. That's what babies like to do. So you're really not going over there with malicious intent to ruin what this child is working on. You're just thinking about what it is that you find interesting and what you want. And again, you don't have this understanding yet as the child of how to take turns properly. So if you're then approached by the adult, by your parent, whomever it may be, who is now scolding you or punishing you for what you've done, it really doesn't seem fair in that moment, does it? Because you're like, I was just doing what I wanted to do. Like, why is it such a big deal? And yeah, so then that child gets frustrated. So it's not a good situation for anybody when we respond in these more traditional ways. It's upsetting for you as the adult, it's upsetting for the children involved, and nobody is learning anything. So instead of all that, in the Montessori approach, we help our children learn how to share by taking turns. And again, this is a very gradual process that happens from the moment that your child is born all the way up through the preschool years and beyond for some children. So it requires a lot of patience on your part, a lot of modeling, a lot of practice, and also a lot of mistakes, because without mistakes, there are no opportunities for learning. So the $1,000,000 question, how do I accomplish this goal? How do I help my child learn how to share by taking turns? Well, it depends on your child's age. Babies are pretty straightforward and easy as far as I'm concerned, because up until about the 1-year mark, they don't have this sense of possession yet. They don't say, this is mine, and really hang on to it in the same way that a toddler or an older child might. Typically, the way babies play is they just kind of meander around. They find something that they think looks interesting, pick it up, turn it over, look at it, maybe chew on it a little, and then toss it and move on to the next thing. And if another child happens to come along and pick up that toy, decide they want to play with it, they don't care. They've already moved on to the next thing. And then at other times, babies might be sitting there playing with something, investigating it, chewing on it, what have you. And then another child comes along who thinks that that object looks interesting because that child has it. And of course, if it's in another child's hands, they want it. And so they come over and they just take it out of their hands. And 9 times out of 10, the baby really doesn't care. They'll just, like, oh, now she has it. And then they just wander off to something else, and it's not really a big deal. But even when our babies are experiencing these kinds of interactions with each other, it can be really helpful from a modeling standpoint to be observing what's going on and helping to translate for our children. We think that as babies, they don't really have a full grasp on what's going on yet, but they really do. And it's helpful to just from the very beginning to set this expectation that we share by taking turns. And one of the ways that we can do that is by translating for them. So if you have two babies that are playing side by side, it's really not necessary to do a whole lot, maybe other than to narrate what's going on. Sometimes this is called sportscasting. It's just basically saying what you see. So if you have one baby with a ball and another one comes over and takes the ball out of the baby's hands, then maybe you might just say something really simple like, oh, she had the ball and now you have the ball. And then that's it. There's not really much more that needs to be said, especially if the children don't really seem bothered by what's going on. You might also say something like, oh, she was playing with that ball and you thought it was really interesting and you wanted to play with it too. Again, just kind of saying what you see. Now, the situation with a baby may look a little different if the conflict over a toy is happening with a slightly older child, maybe a toddler or a preschooler. And in that case, you're definitely going to need to translate on the baby's behalf and maybe even on the toddler's behalf as well. So let's say the toddler comes over and tries to take the toy out of the baby's hand, and maybe the baby is actually kind of clinging onto it and they clearly don't want to let it go yet. Then you can translate for the baby and say to the toddler, it looks like she's still playing with that right now. It'll be available soon. And then the toddler can either sit there and wait and observe what the baby's doing until it's their turn, or you can help them find something else to do. And if the situation is flip-flopped, where the baby is the one coming over and trying to take something from the toddler, then again, we still need to do the same kind of translating because the baby is learning through modeling. They're learning through this practice. So we would still say to the baby, oh, it looks like he's not done with that yet. It'll be available soon. And you'll find that sometimes a child is very accepting of the situation and they're willing to go off and find something else to do on their own. But sometimes they aren't going to be so happy about it and they may express their upset and frustration over the situation, at which point your only role is to just empathize, to be there to support them. I know it's really hard to wait, and then maybe help them find something else to do. And then of course, there are sometimes going to be those inevitable situations where maybe you're a little bit too late to what was going on and the toddler has already snatched something out of the baby's hands and the baby is crying, or maybe the baby has come over and taken something from the toddler and the toddler is crying. Sometimes these things happen. We literally cannot be there 24/7 every second of the day. So when that happens, first off, give yourself some grace, take a deep breath, remind yourself that it's not an emergency and that this is a learning opportunity. So depending on the severity of the situation, you may actually decide not to intervene right away. It's often really helpful to give your child a chance to problem solve a little bit on their own, to figure out how to work their way through a conflict like that independently. But again, depending on their age, they may need some help and some guidance. So if you decide to go ahead and step in and intervene in some way, it's best to be as neutral as possible. You are not coming in and assigning roles to your children where one child is the victim and the poor baby who had their toy taken away and the toddler is the aggressor. How dare you do that to your baby sister or what have you. We want to avoid all of that. You want to be as neutral as possible. So your first step should always be to validate their feelings. Even if you saw what happened and you don't agree with what was going on, just validate both of their feelings. To the child who had the toy taken from them, you can say something really simple like, oh, you were playing with that and then he came over and took it from you and you're really upset now. And then to the child who did the taking, you would say something similar like, oh, you saw her playing with that toy and it was really interesting and you wanted to play with it too. And then your next step, again, is going to be dependent on the ages of the children involved. So if they're capable of a little bit of conflict resolution, some problem solving with your guidance, then definitely go for it. That would be a great next step. But if we're talking about a baby and a toddler who very clearly need some guidance, then you might simply just need to say to the child who took the toy, it looks like she really wasn't done playing with that yet. Would you like to be the one to give it back to her, or do you need some help? You might actually be surprised to see that the child is willing to give the toy back to the other child. When it's been laid out very simply like that for them, and sometimes they don't even realize what's going on. They're like, oh, okay, and they'll give it back with no problem. Crisis averted, and then you can say, thank you for giving that back to her. It'll be available soon. But then there will be times that the child really doesn't want to give up the toy back to the other child, and in that case, then then you can make the decision, again, at your own discretion based on what's going on, but you may make the decision to gently help the child give the toy back to the child who had it initially. And they may be upset about that, and that is okay. They're entitled to their feelings. Again, your role is just to empathize and support them until they're able to process those emotions and move on. So if this is something that you are modeling consistently with your child from infancy, it does get a little bit easier, a little bit faster. I will say that. They are still going to need lots of modeling and practice as toddlers, but when they are seeing it happening on a consistent daily basis in all of their interactions the same way each time, they catch on really fast. So if you've got an infant, now is the time to start practicing with this. Now, when it comes to sharing with older children, with toddlers and preschoolers, you're using all of those same principles. Generally speaking, you are just reminding them every time the opportunity arises that we share by taking turns. So if two children are arguing over a toy, then we observe what's going on, validate feelings again, and then just remind them, it looks like he's still playing with that right now. It'll be available soon. And then the child knows that they either need to wait their turn when they can watch while the child finishes, or they can go off and find something else to do. By the time they get to the preschool years, this routine becomes so routine that it's second nature for them. And you'll hear them using these words all by themselves. They'll actually say to the other child, "Oh, I'm still working with this right now. It'll be available soon." And it's a very beautiful thing to see. I'm actually seeing this playing out now between my preschooler and my older toddler, who is now almost a preschooler, and it's incredible to watch. So I can tell you from personal experience that these strategies for teaching our children how to share by taking turns, they really are effective as long as you are consistent about it. Now, some of the questions that I received in the past about sharing from you guys with regard to things like being on a play date or being at the park, like what do you do in those kinds of situations? It's definitely a little more interesting because you're often surrounded by parents who maybe don't share the same parenting philosophy, especially when it comes to sharing by taking turns. They will force their children to share their toys, and they'll expect that you will force your children to share their toys. And so it can make for a really interesting play date or experience at the park sometimes. But you just have to take a deep breath and remind yourself of what your values are, and remind yourself that your relationship with your child is your number one priority. Worrying about what somebody else thinks is second priority, definitely. And that can be hard to swallow sometimes, I know that, but the more you do it, the easier it becomes. So you can use these same strategies with your child and some other child that they're on a play date with, because they're not confrontational strategies. You're literally just observing, you're validating feelings, and you're respecting your child's need to concentrate on whatever it is that they're working on, or you're respecting the other child's need to concentrate by making sure that you're reminding your child that they need to wait their turn when they see something that another child has. And so it kind of goes both ways. And actually, it can also be really helpful to model these practices for other parents. Like, that's one of the most powerful forms of educating other people, is through modeling it yourself. And so they might see you handling a situation in this way, and it's so different from what they're used to, and it might pique their curiosity, and they might come over and ask you why you did it that way. And that could be, the open for a conversation about the Montessori approach and why you chose to do it that way, and about respecting our children. And if another parent was ever bothered enough to say something negative or judgmental to you about the way they observed you handling a situation, then it's very simple to just say, it's very clear that we have different parenting philosophies, and just leave it at that. And then on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, sometimes you have a sticky situation where a parent has very good intentions, where they're trying to force their child to share the toy that they had with your child because they saw that your child was showing some interest. So again, this is coming from a very good, well-intentioned place on their part, but I think that there is nothing wrong with going over and explaining to the other parent, oh no, at home we share by taking turns, and that's okay. He knows how to wait his turn until your child is done so he can finish, and then he'll have a turn later. And I think that that is totally okay to do, because sometimes they just don't know and they're not aware. And when you are open and honest about that, you're opening that line of communication, and then it makes things easier for everybody. And then another question that often comes up is, what do you do about the child who is taking an extremely long turn with the toy or activity that they're playing with, and maybe there is another child who is waiting? And something that I do in my home that I think works really well is to establish the norm that having long turns at home is totally fine. You can have as long of a turn as you want with any toy or activity, and the other person just has to wait until it's available. So at home, long turns are okay. But then when you're on play dates or if you have somebody coming over to your house, then the understanding is that long turns are not okay. There has to be short turns because we want everybody to have a chance to be able to play with everything in the allotted amount of time that you have. So if this sounds like something that could work for your family, then it's as simple as just sitting down with your children and having that conversation ahead of time so that they know what to expect going forward. All right, so with all of that said, I just want to leave you guys with this little reminder, and it's that we are our children's guides. We don't need to step in every single time and be the referee. We don't need to say something every single time. And even when we are deciding to step in, sometimes we step in too soon. There could be more time that we wait before we actually decide to step in and intervene. And I often find that I'm trying to mentally remind myself of this very common quote that you see out there in the Montessori community, which is that we help our children as little as possible, but as much as necessary. So we're giving them the help that they need, but not too much. So I hope that helps you guys. If you have any other tips or questions about sharing by taking turns, then definitely drop those in the comments down below. If you are interested in learning more about Montessori at home or positive discipline parenting, I offer a couple of e-courses that walk you through it step by step. So I'll be sure to leave a link to that in the description box down below. I also actually just wrote my very first book called The Montessori Home, Create a Space for Your Child to Thrive. And that officially launches in February of 2022, but it is already available for pre-order. So if you're interested in checking it out, I'll leave a link to that down below as well. And finally, just in case you are new to my channel, I also wanted to let you know that this video is part of a much larger series on this YouTube channel called Montessori at Home, which is aimed at providing practical tips and advice for busy parents like you and I for implementing Montessori at home with our children. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in watching more of, then you might consider subscribing to my channel. This way you don't miss a new video, because I do upload a new one just like this one every single week. Thank you so much for watching today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.